The morning began like any other in Ouagadougou. The sun pressed against the embassy walls, motorcycles weaved through the dust, and a long line of hopeful faces waited outside the U.S. consulate, folders clutched to their chests, dreams folded inside. Then, without warning, the screen above the gate flickered. A single sentence appeared. All routine visa services are suspended until further notice. No explanation, no apology. Just silence from the same nation that never misses a chance to preach transparency. Within minutes, confusion turned into whispers and whispers into disbelief. The world's most powerful country had just closed its doors on one of Africa's smallest, Burkina Faso. And why? Because this small, landlocked nation under Captain Ibrahim Traoré had dared to say no. No to a U.S. demand to host deportees expelled under President Donald Trump's immigration crackdown. No to becoming a dumping ground for another nation's mistakes. Inside the embassy, the lights dimmed. Outside, a new kind of diplomacy was born, the diplomacy of defiance. For decades, a visa to America symbolized hope, progress, and the promise that merit could cross borders. But that morning shattered an illusion. Power, it turns out, isn't lost. It's simply redefined. And now a question echoes across Africa and beyond. What happens when a small nation refuses to bow to a superpower? When a government chooses dignity over dependency, does the world punish it or finally respect it? Stay with us as we uncover the story behind this unprecedented visa ban, the real reason Washington acted, the bold response from Burkina Faso, and how Ibrahim Traoré's quiet defiance may be reshaping the meaning of sovereignty across an entire continent. Subscribe if you believe that truth should be louder than power and that dignity, not permission, defines a nation. The morning of October 10, 2025 was hot and still in Ouagadougou. Vendors were setting up fruit stalls along Independence Avenue, the sound of motorcycle engines blended with the call to prayer drifting from a distant minaret. Nothing about the day hinted that history was about to shift. Then, at precisely 9:17 a.m., the digital board outside the U.S. Embassy changed. All routine visa services are suspended until further notice. No flag was lowered, no statement released. Yet the meaning was unmistakable: punishment wrapped in bureaucracy. Within minutes, the news spread through WhatsApp groups, radio stations, and market corners. By noon, the embassy gates were deserted. The last man in line folded his documents, looked up at the silent flagpole, and muttered, "So this is how friendship ends." Inside government buildings, phones began ringing. The rumor was confirmed: the United States had suspended all visas for citizens of Burkina Faso. The reason: Burkina had refused a Washington proposal to receive deportees, men and women expelled under President Donald Trump's renewed immigration crackdown. Officially, the program was labeled humanitarian relocation. But to the Burkinabe government, it was something else entirely: a demand that a proud nation become a landfill for America's unwanted. That evening, national television interrupted its schedule for a special broadcast. Viewers across the country leaned closer to their flickering screens as the foreign minister Kamoko Jean-Marie Traoré appeared. His voice was calm, deliberate, carrying the moral weight of a country that had learned to stand on its own feet. "Burkina Faso is not a land of deportation," he said. "Our hospitality is not an excuse for others to offload their problems." The room fell silent. Across Africa, the statement echoed like thunder. For decades, Western nations had expected obedience. Now, a small Sahelian republic had broken the pattern and done so with dignity. Diplomats in Washington scrambled to explain. Spokespersons called it a technical adjustment. But everyone who understood geopolitics knew better. Embassies do not close doors over paperwork. They close them over pride. On the streets of Ouagadougou, reactions were divided but passionate. Students from the University of Joseph Kizerbo gathered near the Independence Monument, waving cardboard signs that read, "Dignity has no visa." One young woman told a reporter, "Maybe it's time they stop teaching us how to live and start watching how we live." Older merchants nodded in quiet approval. A generation that once queued for American visas was now discovering the power of refusal. This is where the story transcended politics. For the first time, citizens realized that access could vanish overnight and that true freedom was not about entry but autonomy. Under Captain Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso had already been rewriting its destiny. He had nationalized gold mines, renegotiated energy contracts, and insisted that the country's resources must serve its own people first. Washington's deportation request arrived in that context not as cooperation, but as an insult to a new doctrine of self-reliance. Refusing it wasn't arrogance, it was coherence. By midnight, local radio hosts were calling it the day dignity spoke. International Africa news outlets picked up the story. Hashtags like Nenas, Ibrahim Traoré, and Nenas, Burkina Faso trended across the continent. But inside Ouagadougou, something deeper stirred a collective recognition that the nation's backbone had hardened. As one commentator wrote in the Daily Sidwaya, they thought a visa ban would isolate us. Instead, it revealed who truly depends on whom. Thus, from the quiet streets of a landlocked nation, a new kind of diplomacy emerged, one that spoke softly but carried the full weight of moral independence. It was the day Burkina Faso stopped waiting for validation and began defining its own worth. And that, in the history of Africa's long struggle for sovereignty, may prove more revolutionary than any speech, any summit, or any aid package ever offered. When embassies close, they don't just lock doors, they lock dreams. In the days that followed the suspension, the air in Ouagadougou grew heavy with questions. Students holding scholarship offers to the United States stared at blank emails from frozen consular accounts. Businessmen preparing to attend trade expos in Atlanta canceled flights they had waited years to afford. For many, opportunities seemed to vanish in a single digital notice. Yet beneath the disappointment, something unexpected began to grow pride, at first quietly, then loudly. Local radio hosts began using a new phrase, the diplomacy of defiance. What started as a bureaucratic punishment had transformed into a philosophical awakening. The embassy gate's tall, metallic unwelcoming now stood as a monument to inequality. But instead of despair, the mood shifted to reflection. If a foreign nation could shut its doors overnight, what did that say about our own foundations? If another government could decide who gets to dream, what kind of sovereignty did we truly possess? In a televised forum days later, a professor from the University of Ouagadougou summed it up perfectly. The visa was never a favor. It was a filter one that decided who could belong to the global story. And that realization hit deep. As the debate spread, the government of Ibrahim Traoré remained steady. No outrage, no threats, no diplomatic theater, only composure. In one cabinet meeting, Traoré reportedly said, "We don't respond with anger, we respond with example." And that's exactly what he did. Within a week, Burkina Faso announced the removal of all visa fees for African citizens. The timing was deliberate, a symbolic inversion. While Washington tightened its gates, Ouagadougou opened its arms. The message was simple. If others close borders, Africa will open hearts. The decision electrified the region. Traders from Ghana and Niger crossed more freely than ever before. Flights between Sahel capitals surged. Local media dubbed it the new Sahel passport. Suddenly, Burkina Faso, once seen as a quiet landlocked state, had become a leader of continental mobility. Meanwhile, in Washington, analysts scrambled to interpret the backlash. Some called Traoré's move reckless. Others more quietly admitted that it was brilliant. By redefining the rules of engagement, Burkina Faso had turned punishment into policy. The country that was supposed to feel isolated had become the moral center of the debate. Across Africa, students, thinkers, and journalists rallied around a single idea. If you can deny us entry, we can deny you authority. That was the moment the story reached its emotional climax. The visa freeze no longer looked like a confrontation between two countries. It had become a mirror reflecting a century of imbalance between those who grant permission and those who wait for it. In Bamako, Mali's young foreign minister praised Traoré's decision as the first true act of modern African sovereignty. In Dakar, a radio commentator declared Burkina Faso has broken the spell of dependency. And even in distant Caribbean nations, descendants of Africa watch the headlines with quiet awe. This wave of reaction revealed something profound, that dignity once demonstrated is contagious. Burkina Faso had not just said no to deportees, it had said no to hierarchy. And for millions across the continent, that single refusal felt like redemption. The story that began with the dimming lights of the U.S. Embassy now burned brightly in African imagination. It wasn't the end of diplomacy, it was the beginning of equality. From that moment on, every discussion about visas, borders, and migration carried a new question. If a small country like Burkina Faso could stand tall before a superpower, what excuse remained for the rest of us? When the gates of the U.S. Embassy closed, something else opened a national introspection. The visa freeze didn't only suspend travel, it forced Burkina Faso to confront what independence truly means in the modern age. In the days that followed, cafes and radio stations turned into classrooms of political awakening. Conversations once dominated by foreign scholarships and visa lotteries now revolved around agriculture, industry, and innovation. For the first time in years, the question shifted from how do we leave to how do we build. Under Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the government seized that moment. Instead of issuing diplomatic complaints, it launched reforms that would make the nation more self-reliant than ever. Within weeks, Traoré signed decrees prioritizing domestic production over import dependency. Gold refinement plants were expanded in Bobo Dioulasso. Local rice cooperatives received tax exemptions. The Ministry of Education introduced a new civic program titled Dignity as development, teaching students that progress is not a ticket abroad, but a mission at home. It was as if a silent revolution had begun, not in the streets, but in the mindset. Citizens started to see visas not as dreams, but as distractions. Farmers in the north spoke of growing for export, not escape. Young engineers proposed local tech incubators to replace the endless pursuit of foreign validation. The visa ban, intended to isolate, had instead unified. Politically, the transformation was just as profound. The National Assembly, often cautious in foreign debates, passed a resolution declaring reciprocity a core principle of Burkina Faso's foreign policy. If the West reserves the right to restrict our citizens, one parliamentarian said, then we reserve the right to redefine engagement on equal terms. This shift inspired a cascade across the Sahel. In Mali, the government introduced a visa ban for Western diplomats entering the country, a symbolic gesture of parity. In Niger, new mining laws were drafted to favor regional partnerships over multinational giants. Together, these policies formed the skeleton of a doctrine now whispered across Africa's ministries: reciprocity as sovereignty. For the Burkinabe people, the change wasn't just political, it was psychological. The closure of one embassy had opened the idea of many others: African, Asian, Middle Eastern, each offering partnership without humiliation. Within a year, trade expos in Ouagadougou hosted delegations from Turkey, India, and Brazil. Scholarships once controlled by Western donors were replaced by fellowships from Moscow, Cairo, and Beijing. But perhaps the most remarkable consequence was social: the rebirth of confidence. For decades, Africa's youth had been told that dignity comes after approval, that progress must be stamped by someone else's passport. Now, under Traoré's leadership, a new lesson was spreading: respect cannot be imported, it must be built. And so what began as an act of punishment had evolved into a philosophy of nationhood. The so-called visa war had no casualties, yet it transformed how a generation perceived itself. In the words of one journalist from Africa, News Burkina Faso may have lost access to visas, but it gained access to itself. By turning resistance into reconstruction, Ibrahim Traoré had done something few leaders manage. He turned politics into pedagogy and defiance into direction. For the first time in decades, Burkina Faso was no longer following anyone's script. It was writing its own. In Washington, the silence was deliberate. No press conference, no apology, not even an acknowledgement that the visa freeze was retaliation. Behind the marble walls of the State Department, analysts drafted memos about African non-alignment, while television pundits framed Ibrahim Traoré as a populist defying Western norms. But something deeper was happening, something few in the West were ready to admit. The United States, long the architect of global mobility, had just turned immobility into a weapon. For decades, it celebrated freedom of movement as the essence of the American dream. Yet now, it punished an African nation for asserting the same freedom, the freedom to decide its own terms. That contradiction did not go unnoticed. European newspapers called the standoff a diplomatic miscalculation. Editorials in Paris and Berlin warned that Washington's approach risked alienating an entire generation of African leaders who no longer sought validation, but reciprocity. In Brussels, diplomats whispered that the Sahel alliance, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, might soon form a new OPEC of dignity, controlling minerals and influence rather than oil. Across the global south, the tone was different. In Moscow and Beijing, state media praised Traoré as a symbol of multipolar justice. In Ankara and New Delhi, trade ministers extended invitations to deepen cooperation. Even in Latin America, commentators drew parallels between Traoré's defiance and their own battles against conditional aid. But perhaps the most telling reactions came from ordinary people in the West. African Americans watching through channels like Africa News and Black Culture Diary heard something familiar in Traoré's message, the echo of dignity long denied. Letters poured into Burkinabe embassies in Washington and New York, praising the courage to say no without hatred. For many in the diaspora, Burkina Faso had become what the civil rights generation once dreamed of, a place where equality wasn't requested but lived. In universities and think tanks, scholars debated what this meant for U.S. foreign policy. If Washington could no longer buy loyalty with scholarships or visas, what tools remained? If soft power no longer inspired, would hard power return? And if Burkina Faso could stand firm, what would stop others, Ghana, Tanzania, Madagascar, from doing the same? Inside the White House Situation Room, such questions weren't theoretical, they were strategic. Reports warned that the Sahel Alliance's doctrine of sovereignty was spreading faster than sanctions could contain it. Africa was no longer a stage for competition, it was becoming the director. For decades, the Western world assumed that closing its doors would teach humility. Instead, it taught innovation. Denied entry African nations built alternatives. Shunned, they found solidarity. When America whispered isolation, Ibrahim Traoré answered with integration. From Washington's perspective, the story looked like rebellion. From Africa's, it looked like rebirth. And somewhere between those two lenses lies the truth that power is shifting not through war or wealth, but through the courage to define one's own worth. As one retired U.S. ambassador confessed in a candid interview, maybe the era of teaching Africa is over. Maybe it's time we start learning. In the end, the visa ban was never about paperwork. It was a mirror forcing two worlds to see themselves clearly. One that measures worth by permission and another that measures worth by principle. For Burkina Faso, it marked the end of obedience and the birth of ownership. For Ibrahim Traoré, it was proof that leadership in the modern world doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply refuses. From the quiet streets of Ouagadougou to the corridors of the African Union, this moment became a lesson in power, that true sovereignty is not the ability to say yes, but the courage to say no when dignity is on the line. And that courage, once demonstrated, cannot be unlearned. Yet every awakening carries a warning. History shows that when nations reclaim their autonomy, those who once held control rarely surrender it gracefully. Already whispers of economic pressure and media discrediting have begun to circulate. Western analysts now call Burkina Faso a dangerous example. But that phrase meant, as criticism is precisely what makes it historic. Because dangerous examples are what change the world. The American Revolution was once a dangerous example. So was the independence of Ghana or Ghana. Now Burkina Faso joins that lineage not with guns, but with moral clarity. Across Africa, young people are watching. They see that defiance, when guided by purpose, can become construction. That dignity, once restored, can be turned into doctrine, and that Africa's future will not be negotiated, it will be designed. So what comes next? Will the West double down, punishing self-respect with isolation? Or will it recognize what's unfolding? That a generation led by men like Ibrahim Traoré is not anti-West but pro-dignity. The world is watching and history is taking notes. But beyond geopolitics, this story carries a message to each of us. Freedom is not achieved by fighting for entry. Freedom begins when you become the destination. And perhaps that is what Burkina Faso has truly built, not a rebellion, but a reference point. A small nation reminding the world that respect is not granted by power. It is earned by integrity. So as you reflect on this story tonight, ask yourself, do you believe the world is finally ready for a new kind of equality? And should more nations follow the path of dignity, even if it means walking alone for a while? If you believe that truth is more powerful than influence, share this video. If you believe that dignity is Africa's greatest resource, subscribe and stand with those who refuse to kneel.